Hi everyone! Now that we finished talking about the research paper guidelines, you guys know about all the different submissions and the due dates. You know that you're going to be writing this research paper. You know you need to pick a topic, you need to get some articles, you need to gather all this information. I want to talk about reading primary research in general and scientific experiments in general. We talked a little bit in Unit 1 about the scientific method. You know, you make an observation, you or ask a question, and then a hypothesis and predictions and experiment and results, and you go back and you modify your hypothesis or you make new predictions and all this kind of thing. But there's a lot more complexity when you actually get into constructing scientific experiments. And when you start reading your research paper, what you're going to find is that these primary research articles are very dense with information. They are written in a super specific way. They have their own language to them, and not just jargony scientific like textbook language, not just like a list of terms that you need to memorize from the biology textbook, and if you know all of them, you'll be good to go. They have their own grammar to them. They have their own rules of formatting that seem very, very strange, and you have to read quite a few scientific papers before you start being like, yeah, I know why they did that. I understand why it says it like that. Sometimes they will just reference other papers instead of explaining something clearly because this research group has already written a paper on that very thing and they have to save paper space. And so you have to go find the other paper that they're referencing in order to fully understand what it is that they're talking about. So it's somewhat hard to read primary research at times, and I'm hoping to give you just a primer on what you should expect in some of these research articles and what it's like. So this is going to be my introduction to primary research for you guys. Let's get started. On this slide, we have 3 different types of articles, and the first one is a periodical. This is from New York Times Magazine. It's from their kind of like science section, and it says, how much alcohol can you safely drink? How much alcohol can you drink safely? And that's a pretty good title. It's catchy, right? Like if I read that, I think, that's a good question. How much can I drink safely, right? Like, what is the upward limit? Is it what kind of factors would affect that? Is that going to be affected by my metabolism? Like how athletic I am? Does that change things? Or how much tolerance I have? How much drinking I've done over the course of my life, or my body mass, or what's the deal with that? And they've even punched up a little bit to grab your attention with an image of a scientist looking into a microscope. And wait a minute, that's not a microscope, it's a wine bottle. Illustrator Sella Jacobs, you got me again with your whimsical images. Love this illustration, by the way. Wish scientific papers, primary research papers came with beautiful illustrations like this to catch your eye. But scientific research articles almost never come with catchy titles or lovely pastel-colored illustrations. They're usually a lot more complicated and less eye-catching. So this periodical is not referencing this paper, but they're on somewhat similar topics, so that's why I put them next to each other. Oxytocin reduces alcohol cue reactivity in alcohol-dependent rats and humans. Now that is not a catchy title. Good indicator that you're looking at a primary research article there. Another good indicator is that you have this long list of authors right here at the top. Now, generally, the list of authors, very important in a scientific paper. First author, that is a place of high honor. They are the primary author there. Generally, that means that they were the lead author, and sometimes it'll be that this was the primary scientist and other people were like grad students helping them out, but not always. It could be that all of these were significant contributors to it, and in fact, it might be quite a point of contention who would get first authorship. And in some areas, it's now actually becoming a point of contention who gets last authorship on a paper, because you get this final and bang. So it's like it's almost its own special mark there. So the order of the authors is actually quite important. But you'll notice periodical, written by one person. Most scientific papers, you'll get a dozen authors, something like that. Very rare, especially nowadays, that you would see a scientific paper with a single scientist. Science is a deeply collaborative process. Okay. Oxytocin reduces alcohol Q reactivity in alcohol-dependent rats and humans. So, this title, not catchy, but very, very specific. What it's trying to say here is oxytocin, neuropeptide, it's functions in your brain, you've probably heard about it before. It's released when you are giving someone a hug and stuff like that. It got a reputation a little while ago as a kind of good mood hormone. Oxytocin actually reduces alcohol Q reactivity in alcohol-dependent rats and humans. So what they're saying here is that they were testing oxytocin treatments as a drug for trying to wean people who have alcohol dependency disorder off of drinking alcohol, and it seems that it actually did help reduce their symptoms. Complex title, but they got a lot in there. They told you what they were testing. What is this paper about? Oxytocin reduces alcohol Q reactivity in these types of subjects. What subjects were used? Alcohol-dependent rats, alcohol-dependent humans. What drug was being tested? Oxytocin, right? You know all kinds of information about this paper in just this title. You even know kind of what the results of the paper are just from that title. So that is a big important thing. Another way to tell that this is a primary research article is that the journal that it comes in. So this is right here. It's from the paper of Neuropsychopharmacology. And you have the year, you have the volume number, and you have the page numbers. And the page numbers here are up in the thousands. And you have the journal here, and I bet if you go to that link, it's behind a paywall. Now, fortunately, you guys have access through the library to databases of journal articles, so you will not have to pay for any of them. That is one of the big benefits of being a student at a college or being a professor at a college. This is why a lot of scientists work with colleges as well, as they need ways to be able to get access to all these sorts of, that's the one perk of it, is you get free journal access, no other reason whatsoever. But yeah, so that's part of it. Okay, now this, like I said, this article will be written in very, very complex language. The periodical, very, very accessible language. But there's a problem with that. There's a reason why this primary research article is written in complicated, difficult to understand language. It's because the scientists are trying to say something precise and nuanced, and they're trying to say it in as concise a way as possible. And in order to do that, you need very, very specific terminology. Now, in order to make it accessible to general audiences, they have to strip away a lot of that specificity in order to write these periodicals. But when you strip away the specifics, when you strip away that specificity, you end up losing a lot of accuracy along the way. And not every science journalist does a bad job of this. A lot of times they do a really good job of capturing the essence of what the research is, and they'll interview the scientists that do the research, and they'll get their explanation in on it, and they'll double check with them, is this article exactly what it is that you were trying to say? And they'll say, yeah, that's just right. I'll tweak this. And okay, I'll tweak this, and they'll make it right. Sometimes though, they misreport scientific findings. There's been a couple of cases in the news lately where a paper has come out, and the paper did not say anything that was honestly all that earth-shattering, but it was reported in a somewhat irresponsible way, and it caused a lot of people to freak out or come to incorrect conclusions about scientific research. So it's really important as a scientifically literate citizen, as a scientifically literate student, as a person taking a biology course for science majors, to be able to dive into some of this primary research, to at least be familiar and capable of reading some of these primary research articles. Now, more clues that this is primary research. At least that it's a scientific journal article. You have the title, you have this long list of authors, then you have this paragraph right here. This is called an abstract. The abstract is a summary of the entire article. It will give you a really brief introduction to the topic. It will kind of tell you a really brief overview of what they did in the experiment. And then they will give you a very brief summary of their conclusions, of their results of the experiment there as well. So the whole article kind of summed up in this abstract. And abstracts, you'll like this part, are almost always free. You can almost always get abstracts for free for articles. However, for your research paper, you will not be able to get away with only reading the abstract, because I'm going to ask you to take parts from various portions of the article itself. So you're going to have to go further than that. But just a periodical would never have an abstract attached to it. Okay, so that's another thing to look for. And then it usually will start with an introduction. I'll talk about the different parts of a primary research article later. Now, that's not a perfect indicator that it's primary research, because there is another kind of journal article, and that is called a review or a meta-analysis. And these are honestly my favorite to read. I love reading meta-analyses. So same topic, same kind of topic, alcohol use and burden for 195 countries and territories from 1990 to 2016, a systematic analysis for the global burden of disease study 2016. You notice the difference in scale here from the primary research article to the review and the meta-analysis. We're looking at a few rats and humans. We're doing an experiment here. We're testing oxytocin on a few test subjects. Here, we're looking at 195 countries over a 26-year time span, and we're looking at the global burden of disease. Review and meta-analysis, much bigger, much grander view of things. A review and meta-analysis is when a scientist wants to take, when they want to essentially write a paper that shows the state of the science around a particular subject. So they will consume as much primary research, and if there's already some meta-analyses available on that topic, they'll read as much as they can. They'll take tons and tons of notes, highlighters out. They're just gathering as much information as possible, and they will write a mega paper that just sums up with just thousands of citations, hundreds of citations, all the way through it, citing every single fact that they have to every paper that it came from. And they will say, this is what we know about this topic because of all of these studies that we've done everywhere. So this is where they're taking a big, broad view. They're taking all of these different primary research articles, and it could be hundreds. It could be 1,000 primary research articles, and they are summing them up into a big magnum opus of a paper. This is what all of the scientists in this field have done together. Look at it. Look at what we know. And I like reading them because they are actually often more accessible to read than primary research articles are. They're usually written a little bit more like reading a textbook is. It's usually a little bit easier to just kind of read through a review. And they actually include some illustrations sometimes to help out with some of the topics as well. I like, I'm simple, I'm basic, I like illustrations, and so sue me. But they're really nice as well. For your paper, I want you to have a review article. I want you to find 2 primary research articles on your topic, but I also want you to find a review article, because the review article will help you understand your topic. It will tell you more about your topic in a kind of broader view, and then that will help you contextualize what it is that you are reading in your primary research article. Now, often these reviews and meta-analyses, they don't just do a book report. Sometimes they run their own statistics on these studies. So they'll say, okay, this many papers came to this result, this many papers came to that result. Here's, if we run statistics and we gather all of these up and we take away these papers that had problems with their experimental design, and we run statistics comparing all of them, here's what we can definitively say. So when you publish a really well designed review and meta-analysis, you essentially are beginning to see scientific consensus being articulated in that field. You're starting to see, now we know where the field is going. Now we can see what all of these experiments have been building toward. I think I told you guys before, a single experiment doesn't really tell you anything, because results might have happened by chance. Right? You could have gotten a really strong result, but maybe that was just a particularly unusual day. Maybe that was just a roll of the dice and you got that weird result. But if you have hundreds of experiments and they're all saying the same thing, now we're starting to see consensus, and now we can say, something's going on here. All right. I pulled this from episode of last week tonight from John Oliver, but I thought it was a very good point to put into this presentation. So, Professor Matt Whitman of the University of Exeter Medical School said, "When cells become stressed by disease, they draw in enzymes to generate minute quantities of hydrogen sulfide. This keeps the mitochondria ticking over and allows cells to live. If this doesn't happen, the cells die and lose the ability to regulate survival and control inflammation. We have exploited this natural process by making a compound called AP39, which slowly delivers very small amounts of this gas specifically to the mitochondria. Our results indicate that if stressed cells are treated with AP39, mitochondria are protected and cells stay alive." Very specific language, very clear. So he's saying hydrogen sulfide plays a role in keeping mitochondria healthy. So we've created a compound which delivers hydrogen sulfide to mitochondria when they are stressed to help keep them healthy. Time magazine reported, "Scientist says smelling farts might prevent cancer." You might notice that at no point in anything that he said was cancer mentioned, or flatulence of any type. Yes, hydrogen sulfide is one component of flatulence, but when he said this quote, the author at Time magazine just heard hydrogen sulfide, and in their head they just translated that over to fart. And anything that had to do with cells, they assumed it had something to do with cancer. And so they generated this headline and they ran with it. And this is what I mean by when you simplify that specific language that scientists are trying to use, you might lose accuracy. And sometimes that journalists do a really, really good job, and sometimes they do not. All right. So one thing you are going to be doing is evaluating the scientific information in your papers. The data, as reported in peer-reviewed journals, is often very complex. Scientists interpret these data in lengthy discussions, but the public receives them in isolated media headlines, as we've discussed already. In this It's actually from Scientific American, which is interesting. One of the sources I pointed out as a news source. So there's a lot of information contained inside every table that you see inside of scientific paper. Tables and graphs are the stars of scientific papers. If they thought something was important enough to put a table or a graph in, it is darn important. So one thing you might look at is the data collection itself good, or is it flawed? One thing I'm going to ask you to do is try to critique their method of study, their experimental design. Could it have been improved? Did they collect data only from males? This is something common you'll see. You'll see that they only tested male test subjects, and that they're trying to apply results from only male test subjects to an entire population. Now, there might be really good reasons to only use male test subjects or to only use female test subjects, but it would be a case-by-case basis. You'd have to take a look at it in the context of that study. Was the data self-reported by the participants rather than being directly collected by the scientists or measured by the scientists? One of the reasons why nutritional studies are not particularly rigorous is that a lot of their data comes from self-reporting. It comes from surveys that participants put in themselves, because it's not ethical usually to lock people in a isolated, like essentially a prison for an extended period of time and control what they eat in an experiment for nutritional analysis. Usually you just have to say, okay, you're going to be in the high protein group, so make sure you eat lots of protein and be honest about it. And then you're going to be in the low protein group or the high carb group and be honest about it. And the problem with that is people lie. People lie all the time, especially when they're self-reporting on these things, and there's no real penalty for it. So that might be a flaw that you would find in scientific collection. Another thing that you might take a look at, this is looking at caffeine intake. The amount of caffeine per cup may vary. They're using the number of ounces of coffee as a measurement, as a proxy for the amount of caffeine taken in. But what if the amount of caffeine per cup is different? What if they're using different blends of coffee? What if they're using different brews? What if my coffee machine has a button on it to make it stronger or weaker? What if they're using different scoops, right? If it's just inconsistent in the amount, right? Is the sample size too small? That might be something that you would be interested in. You can't run a very valid scientific test with 1 or 2 participants in it. Now, if you get 10 participants, there's some pretty good tests that you could run if it's a very controlled experiment with a relatively small sample size like that. And when you're looking at the data, you might want to make sure that you understand what they're reporting. So people drinking less coffee have a higher risk for PD, Parkinson's disease. But in all groups of coffee drinkers, some of them did develop Parkinson's disease. So it's not a cure or anything like that, but people drinking more coffee do seem to have a lower risk for Parkinson's disease, according to this particular table. Well, this video is running a little bit longer than I expected, so I'm going to break it up into chunks. In the next video, we'll talk about different kinds of studies and correlation and causation and those kinds of ideas as well.